can't explain in words how much I've appreciated your love and you're making me feel at home and a part of the family. Not long ago, Penny and I, who were on the council ring at the Mount Shasta CFO, which is rather primitive. We cook our own food and we live out without tents or any buildings, just out on the ground, and worship God in a kind of almost like the early church. We came to Florida down at Lake Placid at the invitation of a Methodist minister and his wife, and we had a little mini kind of a retreat out on a cattle ranch south of Lake Placid. There's a man that owned a big spread, and we had the kids, all the youth of all of the churches in Lake Placid joined us out on the ground, and we slept out under the stars among the cattle and had a glorious time. And inadvertently, when we left, we invited them to come to California whenever they could make it, and we would try to repay their wonderful southern hospitality. The unbelievable happened. At Easter vacation the next year, we got a call from them that they were on their way with 25 Florida kids. And they landed in San Francisco, and we stayed overnight sleeping on the floor in a little Christian college there, and we saw San Francisco the next day, the cable cars and everything. Then we got into vans, went up into the mountains where there was still lots of gobs of snow, and those Florida kids really flourished. I can't explain to you what a joy and what awe they had in seeing God from the high altitude of our camp at 7,000 feet in the Trinity Alps. Those kids snowball fought from the time they got there till they left, I think. They'd never seen mountains before, most of them, and they just stood there looking up at these things. And we had a glorious time. We put them back on the airplane to San Francisco, and we went back home. And we continued the friendships. They brought 25 Florida kids. We brought 25 California kids. And they blended and mixed out in the wilderness Friday and Saturday and Sunday and Monday at noon. All the California kids went down to see them off at the airport. It was an incredible sociological event for teenage kids to get to know their counterparts diametrically across the United States in Florida. And I think that's of such importance that I try to encourage CFO youth groups to go to another CFO and mix and find out how they talk and what they say and how they feel. Probably the most abundant thing of all was that last year, one of my California kids and one of the Florida kids from Charlie Russell's group down in Lake Placid got married. So we totally and permanently linked Florida to California in a most unusual way. Well, this is our last roll call, and like Rick said the night before last, it is powerful medicine to finish strong. Let's finish strong. Let's go right up to the wire. I remember one time when I was out for football at West Point. I never made the team, but I was out for football. And Vince Lombardi was the assistant football coach at Army. He was Red Blake's assistant. He'd come up from somewhere in New Jersey where he'd been a high school coach and was just beginning his career. And Red Blake made him responsible for getting us in shape. We started in August, and cadets are constantly in shape. They get up at 4:30 in the morning every morning. They're outstanding reveille at 5:15, and you just stay in shape because just doing it is difficult. Well, he had us doing push-ups and rollovers and sevens. 7 is, at the count of 1, you drop down like this, and the count of 2, you jump your feet back like this, and then 3, you go down, 4, you go up, 5, you jump back like this, 6, you come up, and 7, you jump in the air. Well, he had us doing that, and he'd stand there and count and laugh. Vince Lombardi had a space between his teeth, those of you who know or seen him in the movies, and he'd howl, ho, 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 and you could see his teeth. He looked like a monster. And he'd just stand there and count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Jump, you idiots. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Well, after about 2 or 3 minutes of that, you're totally rags. My roommate was Kaz Myslinski. He was from Bessemer, Pennsylvania, son of a coal miner. He was a tough Pole. He and I got together side by side so that I could hide behind Myslinski. He was a huge physical specimen, had taken his undergraduate work at Tennessee and made the football team down there. So he was coming up to help out the military academy. Vince Lombardi caught me, and he came over and he kicked me in the stomach. It was politically correct in those days to kick a football player in the gut. He kicked me and he said, "Bottomley, get into it. I see you hiding there." He says, "You get in shape. We'll win." And that's when Vince Lombardi discovered his famous saying, or notorious, winning isn't everything. Winning is the only thing. Myslinski came to my rescue. He said, "You'll never be a winner unless you put out, Bottomley. You'll never be a winner unless you put out." Myslinski looked up and he says, "Coach, winning isn't everything." Ho, 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 ho! He says, "That's a good one. I'll use that at the Lions Club in New York." He says, "Winning isn't everything. Myslinski, winning is the only thing." And that's where it started. It started that day. But in his book, Vince Lombardi told us what winning is. When he wrote that little incident, probably in his journal, he wrote that little incident, and he said, "And I didn't have time to tell those boys that winning isn't on the sport pages the next morning in the big letters. And winning isn't in the numbers on the scoreboard that are still standing out there that the newspaper reporters are jotting their notes from. Winning is the last minute on the playing field when you're so exhausted you can't move and you're sweating so bad that you're pouring on the grass and killing the grass with salt water. Winning is the last and final minute of 60 minutes of giving it your very best. That's what winning is. Winning is not on the scoreboard. It's not on the sports page. Winning is in your heart. And man, that sticks with you, particularly when a guy like Vince Lombardi with the ugly teeth gives it to you. I've chosen my scripture for this last period from 1 Corinthians chapter 9, starting at verse 24. In a race, this is Paul. This is Vince Lombardi Paul. In a race, everyone runs, but only one person gets first prize. So run to win. To win the contest, you must deny yourself many things that would keep you from doing your best. An athlete goes to all this trouble just to win a blue ribbon or a silver cup. But we do it for a heavenly reward that never disappears. So I run straight for the goal with purpose in every step. I fight this fight of life to win. I'm not just shadowboxing or playing. I'm out there with all my force in the power of the Holy Spirit to make sure that God doesn't bench me in the final minutes of the game. I'd planned and I'd been bribed to tell you a story, finish the story that I kind of alluded to about when I was involved in the Middle East and got put in prison in the Zagros Mountains. Actually, I was going to school and I was dating the daughter of the physics professor at the American University. Who was a beautiful young Arab girl. I wasn't married, so I was free to fiddle around a little bit in between classes. And every evening, every Friday evening, all of the students of the university go down, and in front of the Great Orient Hotel, which is in Beirut on the waterfront, in front of the Orient Hotel is a big plaza that's kind of a park. Trees, acacia trees and grass, and picnic tables. All of the students and many of the townspeople, because there was no air conditioning in those days when I was there, this was in 1951, we would all go down to the park and sit around and talk and sing. And it was a wonderful kind of a little gathering place for the people to socialize on Friday evening. And there would be dancing and singing, and sometimes some musicians would gather and play music. It was a fun time. The American University lies on a high cliff, almost 1,200 feet above the Mediterranean Sea, right facing the west. And you can stand on the cliff near a gnarled old cypress tree and look out west all the way to Gibraltar. You can't see that far, but you can see the curvature of the earth out across the Mediterranean Sea. It's so clear in the eastern, where that campus is. The kids, like any teenagers, instead of going down out the front gate of the university and down the sidewalk along University Avenue, would cut down the cliff, which was 1,000 feet of granite straight down. And they had a little zigzag trail that went down to Harbor Boulevard. Then they'd run down Harbor Boulevard and get to the park and gather down there. This one day, one Friday, we were going down the cliff. And when we got to the bottom, we ran down Harbor Boulevard, and there was a big crowd of kids already there. They beat us there. We were reporting something back to our staff advisor at the university. When we got down there, a bunch of the kids were doing some folk dancing on the grass. It was a grass place. So I decided I would teach them the hokey pokey. And I had a whole bunch. My girlfriend, whose name was Najwa Shaheen, Najwa and I were showing them how to do the hokey pokey. Put your little foot. And they were catching on. It isn't too difficult, you know. All of a sudden, a big black car pulled up over on the fringes, and the attaché, the military attaché from Damascus, came walking out to see me. I knew him. There wasn't an embassy at Beirut. It's too small a town, and it's too friendly to the United States, so that the attaché is in Damascus, and that he kind of half works for Beirut and Lebanon. He came walking over and he says, Bo, I flew with him. To get my flying time in, I flew with him in his C-47 from the embassy. He says, come here, I need you. And I excused myself and went over. We jumped into this black car and drove up the street and over behind the U.S. consulate in Beirut. And there were two other men there. And they gathered me onto one of the cast iron benches, which were along the walk from the parking lot behind the consulate to the rear door of the consulate. And they sat me down, and one of them was a man from Strategic Air Command, a brigadier general in civilian clothes, and one of them was a man whom I vaguely recognized as seeing at the university, but he wasn't in any of my classes, but I knew that he was a professor of something. Anyway, to cut across, They sat me down and told me that the National Security Council back home had sent this guy from Strategic Air Command to personally get in touch with me, who was a student at the American University, with a job. And he exposed the job. He said, your assignment is to measure the length and width and depth of concrete of 12 airfields in the Middle East. The problem was that the National Security Council back home, and you may remember this from the scuttlebutt in the press, had decided that if the balloon went up in World War III and somebody happened to fire a missile or get somebody mad enough to fight, all the SAC bomber fleet would go across the North Pole to strike their pre-assigned targets. All the Russians would come across to strike their pre-assigned target, and the air over the North Pole and the North Atlantic would be filled with aerial combat fighters and missiles and airplanes. So it would be impossible to get back through that milieu to rearm and reload the SAC bombers. Besides that, their bases would probably, half of them, be gone, and they wouldn't know which ones were gone. So the object was to find a place to rearm and reload, refuel. Somebody discovered that there were a whole bunch of 8,000-foot concrete runways abandoned from World War II around the Middle East. The International Airport at Beirut was one of them. One of them was north of Damascus, where the Royal Air Force had a long runway. Nobody there. The United States Army Air Corps had a base that was just north of Baghdad. There were several in Tehran. The Shah was still Shah in Tehran. And so we were very friendly with all those countries, and all these bases were there. They thought, we will just divert the bombers after they've struck their target down to the Middle East. Clear air, nobody fighting there. Land, refuel, rearm, we'll station the stocks there so that they're ready. All friendly countries. In those days, we were friendly with Syria. It was still king. Farouk was still king in Egypt. Israel was there with a big long runway. Jordan, King Hussein was king in Jordan. American wife. The Shah of Iran, an American wife. We were friendly. It's hard to believe. Nuri Said was prime minister in Iraq, gone to Princeton, got his doctorate at Princeton. All of them very friendly Americans, so it was no problem. We wouldn't tell them, but we would lay stocks in there, and then when the time came, we would divert, refuel, rearm, go back and strike the targets. And I said, well, this is very interesting, but I'm a fighter pilot. I don't have anything to do with bombers. In fact, I one time landed to refuel at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. They came out and surrounded my airplane with armed guards, told me that they don't refuel fighters. They only refuel bombers. The guy says, this is an assignment from the President of the United States. I said, cut that out. The President of the United States doesn't know me from Mickey Mouse. I'm a fighter pilot, and I'm going to school, and I have a date to dinner tonight, and I'll see you guys later. Well, the other guy that I recognized as being somebody I had known was the professor of economics at the American University. His name was William Colby. William Colby, later chief of the CIA, whose body floated to the surface of a tributary of the Potomac River 2 years after he was chief of the CIA and Nixon fired him. William Colby was the master spy of the Middle East to the United States of America. I didn't know that. But the trouble with William Colby as a spy was that he looked exactly like a spy. He had the coldest blue eyes, kind of light blue eyes, almost white. They're so light blue. And when he looked at you, he caught you. Man, you could not look away. And he told me after I'd said, they said, well, General LeMay, they thought General LeMay's name would terrify me, like he did most people. Said, General LeMay wants you to measure these runways. He can't send out his SAC bombers without having someplace to go to refuel. And I let out a string of expletives about General LeMay, and then I found out this guy was a general. I didn't know he was a general. He's in civilian clothes. I called him Mr. Johnson, and he said, General Johnson. And I popped to attention. Then I started paying attention. Well, to cut a long story short, and I'm not going to tell this story. I thought I'd come over and tell the story because it's a fabulous story. But I thought if I don't tell this story, maybe they'll invite me back. But I was not trained as a spy. And they told me it's not spy. If they catch you measuring the depth of the runway, I'm out there with a shovel, shoveling. What are they going to think you're doing? He says, you just tell them that you're an American flyer and you're going to the American University Graduate School and that you have an airplane, you're over there to see if their airport's good enough to land on. Or that you're an Air Force officer on TDY at the university and you want to see that you might want to bring some fighters over to show off to them. Tell them some story like that. They're all friends anyway. Well, I believe that. When you're 28, 29 years old, you're a sucker for guys that have the gift of the gab and they're smooth talkers. And Colby was slick. Well, anyway, I started measuring runways. And I had to call it in to the Voice of America in Vienna, Austria. That should have given me a clue that this wasn't really very friendly. But I call in the numbers, the length number, the width number, and the depth of country. And I did the international airport at Beirut. Actually, I went into the library at the university and found it in a book in there. I didn't measure it. I wasn't a Christian yet, so I could cheat in a lot of different ways free. I measured the one north of Damascus and called it in, and I began to be prickly. I began to feel prickly, like, this is exciting, you know? General MacArthur was a spy for a little while. I could be like General MacArthur. I might have 4 or 5 stars here if I do this job right, and it seems to be pretty easy. Well, it was easy, but I got caught. About sundown, measuring the old RAF base north of Mosul in northern Iraq, there was a coup in Iraq and they changed governments, and I didn't know about it because I was a student back at the American University. I flew over to Baghdad, took a car up to Mosul, and I was measuring the runway when a jeep full of the Revolutionary Command Council caught me. And I escaped, and they caught me again, and I escaped, and I ran across the border. I ran up past Old Nineveh. You know, Old Nineveh is just east across the Tigris River from Mosul, and I ran, actually, I slept overnight in the digs, the archaeological digs of Old Nineveh. Then I followed some peasants, some herders up through the mountains. I was going to cut across because the Americans had military missions all over Iran, and if I could cross the border, I'd just walk into an army mission, and they would give me a car and a driver and new clothes and a bath because I was a major in the United States Air Force. They had to treat me with great respect, and I dreamed that I would be back at the university by Thursday. Well, I got caught, and the freedom fighters of the Zagros Mountains threw me into a pit with 6 other political prisoners to rot. And the story about how we survived the year and 37 days until we were rescued by an earthquake that split the mountain open and we were set free. But I'll tell you that story some other time. Or you can buy the tapes. I'm putting it on tape. I want to close by telling you 2 quick stories. Both of them have to do with this theme that fascinates me about how God works in mysterious ways, his wonders to perform. And it's really exciting to try to keep up with what he's doing with our lives, isn't it? We never know, and what a joyful surprise when we think we're in the depths and are about to quit and throw up our hands, and he comes through the most amazing, unexpected sort of thing. When I was commander of the F-105s in Thailand, one morning reported in to me a tall, handsome, good-looking young 22 or 23-year-old pilot. He saluted and smiled at me, and I thought, man, this has got to be the next war ace if you ever saw one. His name was Jim White. Some of you knew Jim White. Jim White was the younger brother of Ed White. Ed White died in the flaming fire on the Cape Canaveral pad on the first moon flight with Gus Grissom. Remember? His dad was Major General White, who was a World War II hero and lives in Sarasota. You've known them. Ed White was a national hero. He was going to be the first man to walk on the moon. He died with a great oxygen fire when they were testing out the first moonshot. Ed White, I knew as a brigadier general, and I knew he was a hero. When this boy had reported in to me and told him who I was, I left him standing there and went back into my office to ask my sergeant if he was the Jim White that was the only brother of Ed White who'd been the astronaut. He said, yes, sir. So before I went back in, I called General Brown on the hotline, the 7th Air Force. And I said, I got Jim White is reporting in here. He said, yeah, he's old General White's son. He said, you take care of him. Because they were close friends. I thought, wow, now I've got to babysit. Well, you have to do that sometimes when you're kind of... Well, Jim White was so personable, he won all of our hearts, and the first thing you know, he was a part of the family. He was a great kid. He was tall, good-looking, athletic. But unbeknownst to me, he had just got married before he came over, and he'd brought his wife over, and she was in a hotel down in Bangkok. Wow, this was not allowed. But I didn't know about it, except I found out about it through my underground. After about a week, I began to get guys, squadron commanders would come to me and they'd say, Colonel Bowe, Jim White is not a very good pilot. And I'd say, what's the matter? He said, we had to refuel every flight. As soon as you take off the flight, they join up. You go to a tanker, and the tanker floats in the air, circles in the air over the Laos, Vietnam, Cambodian border. You have to go up there and top off and refuel, and every airplane has to come in under the tanker, like you saw in the movie. There's a good movie, a good shot of the tanker working in the movie. You have to come under, and you have to fly your airplane so carefully that a little cone about that big around, your probe goes into that cone. And if you get jiggly out here, which you do if you're low on fuel, because you're tense, you know, you got to get fuel or else you're going to go down. And you find, God, you miss it and you miss it. Pretty soon the boom operator says, go out, get out of here. I'll take somebody that can do it. And they can do it. They can order you out. And you either bail out or crash land your airplane or go into some other base and get fuel. Well, if there's no other base around, it's tough luck. They said, Jim White, he can't refuel. He gets nervous and he jumps around, and they twice sent him off, and he had to divert to another base, to an emergency landing base. And then we have to go get the airplane and bring it back. I said, well, that's unusual. So I called General Brown. I said, we're having a little trouble with your friend's son. He doesn't fly as well as we thought he did. And General Brown said, well, he got through flying so because he's a hero's brother. But take care of him. So I thought, okay, I'll fly with him. And I flew with him, and he had trouble staying in formation. So I give him spread formation. Then they didn't have to worry about staying close to you and worry about jumping around because you're way out here. And I'd fly him across until we got into the target area, and then I'd give him the sign for trail, and they'd fly in trail. He could do that okay. But he couldn't refuel. And he bounced badly on landing, and one time he had to bring his whole load back because he was unable to link up with the tanker, so he decided to come back home again, and he blew out both tires because of the heavy load of the airplane. The tires aren't made to land with the load that you're taking off with. He landed heavy and blew out both tires, and the runway was closed for a while. I thought about transferring him down to 7th Air Force Headquarters, give him back to General Brown, give him an office job. But General Brown wouldn't take him. He said, no, he is General White's son, and he is going to get some medals, so you just stay with him. You got to be a mother, grandmother, and everything for all these kids when you're wing commander. Well, about 3 days later, he was missing. His flight came back, and he didn't come back. And I thought, oh, God, now what? Anyway, we went out. I got quickly with the flight commander, and we briefed that they were flying some targets in the Plan de Jar in Laos. They were hitting some artillery supplies and some artillery guns, and there was puffy clouds down below and a big mountain, and these supplies were hidden in the lee of this mountain, and they rolled in and dove through the clouds, and at the bottom, they turned out and came back around. There were 4 in the flight, and they called off the target at the bottom. The kid would just say on the radio, off, number 4 off, number 3 off. At the top, they'd call in, number 1 in, number 2 in, and you just fly in a circle with the 4 of you around the circle. And I says, was it normal, standard thing? He said, well, it was standard except for one thing, and that is normally airplanes peel off to the left. You saw them in the movie, and you've probably seen them in an airport. We fly in formation like this. When you come into the field, you come in on the approach to the field, number 1 nods to number 2, and then he peels off and comes around lands. They give 4 seconds, and number 2 peels off and comes around land. 3 gives it 4 seconds, peels off and comes around land. You'll always do it left hand, around to the left. And when you fly on a target, number 1, he gives signals to number 2 that he's rolling in. He calls in, 1 in. He rolls in, he rolls out to the left on the bottom, comes up, and he hears number 2 call in. He rolls out at the bottom, comes up. Well, he said, because the karst cliff was right there, I told him right-hand pattern. And everybody nodded. He looks down the line. Everybody nods that he's got it. They pulled out to the right. Well, I went up and I flew all over the area. We couldn't find any evidence of a crash. No steel, no wheels, nothing. No smoke. Nobody reported from the area that any crash had occurred, which you usually get. Even peasants will call in and finally it'll get back to you. I went up there and I searched and searched and searched, couldn't find anything. Then some smart young lieutenant who was not involved at all, over drinks at the bar a recent night, right after that, told me, he says, Colonel, do you suppose that he peeled off the bottom and turned left, and the clouds were down low, and he may have gone through a cloud and suddenly found himself on that karst cliff that was right there. And I thought, that is a splendid idea, because he may have been preoccupied with doing all the things that he didn't do well, and he might have forgotten that he's supposed to turn right, and he turned what is normal left. So I went up with an airplane all by myself. After I hit a target that was assigned to me, I went back and I slowed down the airplane, put down the flaps, put down the gear, and very slowly at about 250 miles an hour flew carefully by the mountain, as if I'd turned off to the right, to the left instead of the right, as he would have done. And there in a cleft in the mountains, I saw the sun flash on some steel that looked like a turbine blade. And I thought, do you suppose? And I went back around, put on the power, came back around, did the same thing again. And sure enough, I could see there locked in the cleft pieces of a wing and a whole turbine blade, that's very identifiable because of all the little blades around it. Locked in that cleft. That airplane had turned out there and just flown into this crevice in the mountains so hard and fast that it stuck in there. And Jim White had died there. So I came back and I called General Brown. I said, sir, you can take him off the missing list. He's KIA. He said, why? He said, you come up here and I'll show you. I know right where he's buried, in the karst cliff in the Plan de Jar of Laos. He called Jim's father. Jim's father was in Sarasota, Major General retired. His mother was fit to be tied because Jimmy was missing. She'd lost her only other son on the pad at Cape Canaveral. Now she didn't have any children at all of her family left. And she was in mental disorder. Old retired General White asked me, he called me as soon as General Brown had called him. He asked me if he could come out and talk to me. And he's a retired Major General, so he could do that. He could come into the combat zone on invitation. I said, yes, please, General, come on out and let me show you where your son died. He decided that if he could tell his wife, Jim's mother, that he had seen where his son had died, she would be relieved. Then she could close. So he came out. He landed Baghdad, sent Jim's wife home on an airliner, and came up to see me. I put him in flying clothes. He'd been a pilot and whatnot, not long retired. Put him in an oxygen mask, and I put him in the back seat of a two-seat F-105, and we took off. We briefed and everything. I told him what to expect, how we were going to fly the same mission Jimmy had flown his last mission, and how I was sure that he'd turned off to the left and made a logical mistake, and that he was buried in the cliff, the karst cliff of this tooth-like mountain in Laos, and that I would take him exactly the way Jimmy had gone, and he could see it. Well, this was about a month and 2 days after I had flown there and seen the wheel. But I was perfectly confident that I could find it again. So we loaded up, we went up, we air refueled, we went out, we struck a target, he and I together. He was thrilled to get death, to be able to put his foot into the war a little bit. And when we came back, I said, it was right here. The target is right down there. You can see where the bomb craters are because they destroyed that ammunition supply. That flight, Jimmy's flight, destroyed it, and you can see it down there. But I think what Jimmy did, and I says, hold everything. I put down the gear and the flaps, and I slowed the airplane down, made the turn. I said, I was talking to him on the intercom. He was in the back. I said, he pulled off like this, and there was puffy clouds. And there are no clouds today, it's clear. But there were puffy clouds right in here, and I think without being able to see, he went into one of these big clouds and hit into the karst cliff. And I said, You will see it right out there on the right-hand side because I know exactly where to find it. And I slowed the airplane down to almost 200 miles an hour, very almost dangerous speed, so slow. And I flew gently by the cliff, and I looked out to the karst on the side, and the wreckage of the airplane during that month and a few days had completely regrown over with jungle. Vines and bushes and leaves. It was in the monsoon season, and the stuff just, you can see it and hear it grow. It had grown up where the accident had occurred and completely covered the cleft. I couldn't see anything. I was irritated. I thought I was in the wrong place. So I pulled it around again. I didn't say anything because I was afraid to say it. I did the same thing again. I said, General, we'll fly by again so you can make absolutely sure that you saw it. I pretended like he had seen it, but I hadn't, and I knew he hadn't either. Well, you got to do some funny things sometimes. I put down the gear and the flaps, and I flew gently and slowly by right up there, even closer and very slow. And I looked over there again. I dropped down a little bit. I climbed up a little bit as we flew by. It was all solid green like moss. It buried the evidence, totally covered the entrance. I pulled up the gear and popped the afterburner, climbed on out. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. I went back and landed. I didn't say anything to him. I kind of patted him on the shoulder and whatnot, nodded. I had kind of a positive attitude. We took off his flying suit and his jacket and his personal equipment, hung it up in the locker, walked into my desk in my office. I said, well, I've got a car for you to take you back to Bangkok, General. He came over to me and he put his hands out on my shoulders. He's a tall, good-looking guy for about 65. Put his hands on my shoulder and he says, Colonel Bottomley, I want to tell you how much I appreciate you doing this. He said, I saw the wreckage of Jim's airplane, and now I'll be able to quiet his mother. When I get back at Sarasota, I will tell her that I saw the wreckage of where Jim died, and it's inaccessible to anybody or anything, and she will feel warm and be able to close his death. He was killed in combat. And he turned and walked out to the car, disappeared out of my life. God had shown him what he came to see. I couldn't see it. I didn't need to see it. But God showed him where his son had died so that he could tell his mother. God works in mysterious ways. I was sure that General White knew that he had seen where his son had died. Don't tell me why. Don't ask me about it. Now I want to quickly tell you a final story so we can go do important things. I told you before that after the war I joined up with Campus Crusade for Christ, and for about 12 years I traveled to the military bases around the world, sharing the 4 spiritual laws and teaching them how to do it, and also teaching them how to set up a little barracks Bible study and how to individually establish a method of doing a quiet time with the Lord to start their day. During this time, after I'd gotten out of the service, I was continuing to drink, and I couldn't kick the habit of alcoholism. And my sons and my wife and everybody else kept telling me, this is dangerous. You are serving God. I would be sober while I was serving God, but in the evening, I would be exhausted. I'd come home from a long trip and I'd drink a gallon of wine and sleep for 2 or 3 days. It was terrible. I began to get the psychology and psychosis that goes with that, the guilt and the feeling of remorse. And I'd wake up in the middle of the night thinking, what if Bill Bright finds out that you're a sloosh? What would your dad and mother think about you if they knew that the son that they'd raised up to become great was such a drunk? And I was really getting depressed. Well, my 2 sons took me and put me into Scripps recovery, alcoholic recovery, and it worked on me like it works on very few people. Alcoholism is a disease of reoccurrence, you know. Most people fall back and they have to try again and again, and only the persistent survive. Well, I went through Scripps, and my 2 sons prayed for me when I came out that I would never want to drink alcohol again, that it would take away, God would take away the desire to drink from me forever. We prayed that together on our knees on the grass just outside Scripps Hospital in La Jolla. It worked. God answered that prayer, and I never again had a desire to drink. But I had to, for a year, keep going to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings right around there. Around the Scripps Rehab Center are dozens of Alcohol Anonymous meetings. So you don't have a hard time finding one every night. My roommate was a lawyer. This lawyer was a world-class wine taster. While he was going to recovery, he would get telephone calls from people in Turkey to come to a wine tasting festival because he was known all over the world to be able to tell what grape, what vineyard, what date. He just had that gift. Can you imagine a guy like that trying to get sober? He wasn't about to make a commitment that he would never drink alcohol again. It was worth millions of dollars a year to him. He was famous. He and I he was my roommate. I heard all his stories and I pitied him and whatnot, but when we left, we went down to the beaches at Carlsbad and got an apartment because we had to go back to group. Every 3 days we had to go back to group and report how we were doing in our sobriety. He and I were there, and when I went into recovery, Campus Crusade for Christ, Bill Bright forgot me. You know how we shoot our wounded as Christians? He would not communicate with me anymore. He didn't want anybody to know that associated with him was this drunk. So when I came out, this lawyer and I got an apartment and we started going back to group. And I started a physical fitness program because I knew I was out of shape. I weighed about 165, 70 pounds, and I normally weigh 150. So I started a running program. There's a big park there in Carlsbad, runs right along the ocean. The ocean sweeps out from there. There's a little dip and down along the beach, the ocean. And I would run way up to a power plant, which is 1.5 miles, and then I'd go down the steps to the beach and run back. Then I'd come up and I would sit at a little bench on the park because there was a walkway, a little bench, and I would sit there and meditate and pray. And I felt like I had let God down and I was gone. I didn't know how to get back in contact with Jesus Christ. And I felt sorry for myself, and I felt very depressed. I was going through that dip, which alcoholics have to go through to get out the other side. Well, one morning, I did this run. It was the second or third morning we'd been there. My buddy was still in the sack. Wealthy lawyers don't get up early anywhere. I got up early, and it was foggy. The mist, the diurnal drift of the mist had come in over the land. I ran down to the power plant. I felt pretty good. I went down, I did 25 push-ups on the sand, and I ran back, and I climbed up the steps, and I was exhausted. So I sat down on the bench looking out to the ocean. I put my hands up on the back of the bench and my feet down on the sand. The bench was kind of on the grass. And I just sat there, and I looked up, and it was so foggy you couldn't see the light on the street that changed green to red. And I thought, boy, this is foggy. I looked down towards there's a fish restaurant and a surfboard place about 100 yards down. I couldn't see it. Fog, morning fog. And the sun was hitting a patch of sea and turning the green of the sea gold. And I kind of focused on that and was praying, asking God to come back. Don't leave me alone. I can't handle it alone. And I felt like I was just about to make a breakthrough and get in contact when all of a sudden, out of the corner of my ear, I heard coming through the mist a little child chattering away, and then the muffled voice of a grandmother admonishing or talking back in Spanish. And pretty soon, out of the mist, down the little walkway, came this tiny little Mexican tot with a pretty little flouncy dress and white tennis shoes and long, curly black hair. Beautiful child. And she came dancing ahead of her grandmother down, and she saw me. And she stopped and just stared at me. Well, I felt resentful. She'd come in to my meditation and wasn't invited. Alcoholics have funny mood changes, and I was angry. I felt like saying, well, hit the road, kid. Get out of my way. You're blocking my view. But I didn't say anything. I just looked at her. And pretty soon, in a second or two, her grandmother came. An elderly Mexican woman with a big sewing bag and a long dress. And she quickly said something in Spanish to the little girl, and she went back and took her hand. Well, for reasons known but to God, they walked right past me and then sat down on the bench right opposite, facing me, only diagonally across. My resentment turned to road rage. I thought, lady, there are 2,000 benches. There is a mile of walk. You do not have to sit there. I am having a problem, and I want to do my problem without any help. You know how you can get it sometimes? I was caught. So in order to harbor and handle the irritation, I closed my eyes and stopped looking as the sun was bursting out and breaking up the mist slowly. And I sat there praying, and I was just in this whisper shouting out to God to please don't leave me, don't go away. And all of a sudden, I felt my bench shake. And I opened the corner of one eye, and that little girl had left her grandmother and come over and was kind of backing up to my bench. And she looked at me, and then she'd look at her grandmother. And then she'd ooch down a little bit, look at me, look at her grandmother. And then she'd ooch down a little bit, look at me, look at her grandmother. I thought, you brat. I squeezed my eyes shut and I bit my lip to keep from saying something that I knew I couldn't take back in after I'd said it and spoil somebody's day. And I was incredibly concentrating when all of a sudden she touched my leg. I had on shorts and she touched my leg. And I opened my eyes and she was looking at me. Big, beautiful, dark brown eyes, big as saucers. And she said, "What you doing? What you doing?" Well, this irritated me more. because I didn't know what I was doing, really. How do you answer a stupid little idiot brat, ankle biter, that's asking you stupid little questions? But I was with Campus Crusade. I've been through staff training, so I had a bag of goodies that you can spout out when you get caught in trouble like that. So I said, I'm talking to Jesus. That's one of the things we say at Campus Crusade. I'm talking to Jesus. And I shut my eyes again. I thought that'll take care of her. I shut my eyes again. Next thing I knew, I felt her between my knees out here in front. And I opened my eyes a little bit. She comes between my knees, climbs up on my lap. With her knees on my thighs, she reaches out and points to me and says, "Where is he?" And she looks under. She looks under the bench and she looks behind me. I looked over at her grandmother, and her grandmother was pretending like she wasn't noticing, was knitting away on something. She didn't want to claim that she had anything to do with it. Where is he? Well, I responded automatically like Campus Crusade. He's in my heart. But I didn't say it. I just tapped my chest. And I shut my eyes. I thought, she'll go away. I've handled this one. She'll go away. The next thing I know, I feel these three little fingers. She's pulling my mouth open to see. I sat there with my mouth open and my eyes wide. I couldn't believe what was happening. And her eyes were about that far away, and she's looking right into my eyes. This eye into that eye, and this eye into that eye. And all of a sudden, she saw the reflection, that you get from that mirror of eyes. And she went, "Oh, I see him. I see him." She jumped down off from my lap and ran over. "Grandma, Grandma, Grandma, I saw Jesus." You know what that did to me. For reasons known but to God, that burst my heart wide open. That changed my attitude completely. It was as if Jesus Christ himself had exploded my heart and said, "I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. And through a little child, I will prove it to you." I jumped up out of my seat and I jumped clear across the concrete, and in the grass overlooking the great Pacific, I threw my arms in the air and said, "God, thank you. Oh my God, thank you. Thank you. You were there all the time." And then I thought, I've got to thank that little girl and her grandmother for choosing to come by here. And I turned around and I jumped back across the grass and in the path. There was no one there. I looked and the sun had now burned. I could see all the way to the power plant. Nobody. I turned and I could see all the way to the fish house and the great hotels in the town. There was no one there. There was no one across the street. I was alone in the morning. God had healed me in a mysterious, miraculous way. He does it to us all the time if we're sensitive, open, fully alive. Let's pray. Father God, in the name of Jesus Christ, in the power of your mighty Spirit, we thank you for times like these, when we can gather with you in our midst, feel your presence, and know you're here, rejoice. You tell us that joy is the most infallible indication of the presence of God. God, keep us in the joy of Jesus, now, forevermore.